gut influences your brain, and your brain influences your gut. If you were to take the head of a pin and look at it under the microscope, you could fit many, many hundreds, if not thousands or more of these little microbacteria. If one's main goal is simply to lose weight, then it really does not matter what one eats, provided that mice that ate a highly palatable, high-fat diet, a great-tasting diet, but only during a restricted feeding window of each 24-hour cycle, maintained or lost weight over time. Whereas mice that ingested the same diet, same amount of calories, but had access to those calories around the clock, gained weight, became obese, and quite sick.
Infants that are born by C-section actually have a gut microbiota that looks more like human skin. The difference is that when we put the mice on a low-fiber, high-fat diet and then kept them on that for multiple generations, we saw this progressive deterioration over the course of generations, where by the fourth generation, the gut microbiome was a fraction of what it originally was. Let's say 30% of the species only remained.
Gut is communicating to your brain both directly by way of neurons, nerve cells, and indirectly by changing the chemistry of your body, which permeates up to your brain and impacts various aspects of brain function. But it works in the other direction too. Your brain is influencing your entire gut. And when I say entire gut, I don't just mean your stomach, I mean your entire digestive tract. Your brain is impacting things like how quickly your food is digesting, the chemistry of your gut. If you happen to be stressed or not stressed, whether or not you are under a particular social challenge or whether or not you're particularly happy, will in fact adjust the chemistry of your gut, and the chemistry of your gut in turn will change the way that your brain works. Actually, from the moment that you came into the world, that microbiome was being established. It was actually strongly impacted depending on whether or not you were born by C-section or by vaginal birth. And it was strongly impacted by who handled you when you came into the world. Literally, the hands that were on you, how much skin contact you had, whether or not you were a preemie baby or not, whether or not you had pets at home, whether or not you were allowed to play in the dirt, whether or not you were allowed to eat snails, or whether or not you were kept in a very antiseptic environment. All of those experiences shaped these little microenvironments and shaped what constitutes best or worst for those microenvironments. If you were to take the head of a pin and look at it under the microscope, you could fit many, many hundreds, if not thousands or more of these little microbacteria. Now, they're constantly turning over in your gut, meaning they're being born, so to speak, and they're dying off. And some will stay there for very long periods of time within your gut, and others will get excreted. About 60% of your stool, as unpleasant as that might be to think about, is made up of live and dead microbacteria. So you're constantly making and excreting these microbacteria. And which microbacteria you make and how many stay inside your gut and how many leave depends a lot on the chemistry of your gut, and depends very strongly on the foods that you eat and the foods that you do not eat. What you eat influences your microbiome, but also what you do, what you think, and what you feel. And many of the little microbacteria that get into your digestive tract do so by way of social interactions. If you ask a neurobiologist what the role of the microbiome is, they'll tell you that it's there to impact brain function. But microbiologists, they'll tell you, well, maybe the brain and nervous system are there to support the microbiome. It's the other way around. You have all these little microorganisms that are taking residence in our body. They are taking advantage of the different environments all along your digestive tract. They are taking advantage of the sorts of social interactions, the people you talk to and that breathe on you, the people that you shake hands with, the people that you kiss or don't kiss, the people that you happen to be romantically involved with or not, your dog, your cat, your lizard, your rat, whatever pet you happen to own is impacting your microbiome. There's absolutely no question about that. The other amazing thing that these microbiota do is they change the way that your brain functions by way of metabolizing or facilitating the metabolism of particular neurotransmitters. So one of the ways that having certain microbiota present in your gut can improve your mood or degrade your mood, for instance, is by way of certain microbiota being converted into or facilitating the conversion of chemicals such as GABA. GABA is what we call an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's involved in suppressing the action of other neurons. And that might sound like a bad thing, but all types of sedatives, for instance, alcohol, and a lot of neurons that naturally make GABA can help quiet certain circuits in the brain, for instance, circuits responsible for anxiety. Our experience of and our desire for particular foods has everything to do with how those foods taste. It also has to do with their texture and the sensation of those foods in our mouth, and even indeed how they go down our throat sometimes can be very pleasing or very unpleasant. And it also has to do with this subconscious processing of taste that occurs in the gut itself. And again, when I say gut, I don't just mean in the stomach. There are actually neurons, neuropod cells further down your digestive tract, which are signaling to your brain about the presence of sweet foods and causing you to seek out more of those foods or to consume more of those foods. What is the signal? How does it actually make me want more of those foods without me realizing it? Well, it does that by adjusting the release of particular neuromodulators. For those of you that are not familiar with neuromodulators, these are similar to neurotransmitters, but they tend to act more broadly. They tend to impact many more neurons all at once, and they go by names like dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, epinephrine, and so forth. Dopamine is often associated with a sense of pleasure and reward, but it is more appropriately thought of as a neuromodulator that impacts motivation, craving, and pursuit. It tends to put us into modes of action, not necessarily running and moving through space, although it can do that too. But in the context of feeding, it tends to make us look around more, chew more, reach for things more, and seek out more of whatever it is that's giving us that sensation of delight or satisfaction. And again, that sense of delight and satisfaction you might experience only consciously as the way that something tastes on your mouth, but it actually is caused again by both the sensations in your mouth, but also by the activation of these neuropod cells. Robert was saying he doesn't believe that we have any free will. He thinks that events in our brain are determined by biological events that are below our conscious detection and that occur seconds to milliseconds before we make decisions or assessments. And therefore, we just can't control what we do, what we think, and what we feel. And at the time, I sort of didn't buy it. I thought, I don't know. I guess I really wanted to believe in free will. And to some extent, I still do. But as we talk about how these neurons in our gut and these hormones in our gut are influencing our brain and the decisions that we are making, at the level of circuits like the hypothalamus and the nucleus of the solitary tract, these are areas of the brain way below our frontal cortex and our conscious perception. I think these are examples that really fall in the favor of what Dr. Sapolsky was arguing, which is that events that are happening within our body are actually changing the way our brain works. So we might think that we want the cupcake. We might think that we don't need to eat something or do need to eat something, and that is entirely on the basis of prior knowledge and decision-making that we're making with our head. But in fact, it's very clear to me that our body is shaping the decisions that our brain is making, and we're not aware of it at all. We all would think that just increasing microbiota diversity is always a good thing, but there are thresholds beyond which excessive microbiota diversity might be problematic. Some forms of stress that can, quote-unquote, negatively impact the microbiome include fasting. Long periods of fast, which makes sense because a lot of microbiota need food in order to thrive. Many, if not all of them, do at some point. So what should we do in order to maximize the health of our gut-brain axis? Some of that is going to be through the basics. Getting deep sleep of sufficient duration. It's going to be proper hydration. It's going to be proper social interactions. It's going to be proper nutrition, limiting excessive prolonged stressors or stress. If one's main goal is simply to lose weight, then it really does not matter what one eats, provided that the number of calories burned is higher than the number of calories ingested. However, there are many factors that impact that calories burned part of the equation. Some of those are obvious: amount of exercise, type of exercise, basal metabolic rate, how much energy one burns just sitting there. NEAT, non-exercise induced thermogenesis, where if people bounce around a lot and fidget a lot, they can burn anywhere from 800 to 2,000 calories per day. So their quote-unquote basal metabolic rate is actually much higher simply because they're fidgeters, whereas people who tend to be more stationary have a lower basal metabolic rate on average. Hormones such as thyroid hormone and insulin and growth hormone and the sex steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen, those levels will also profoundly influence the calories out, the calories burned component of the calories in, calories out equation. What you consume is less important than the amount of food that you consume, at least for sake of weight loss, not necessarily for sake of health. Growing up, I think we all know people who can eat a ton and never seem to gain any body fat, or people who seem to eat very little and seem to gain body fat very easily. And I was always intrigued by that. And it turns out the nervous system is the one that we can really control, both through behaviors and what we eat, but also in terms of this thing that we call thermogenesis. So one of the most powerful ways to stimulate epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, from these neurons that connect to fat and to thereby stimulate more fat mobilization and oxidation is through movement. But I'm not talking about exercise. shiver or shivering is a strong stimulus for the release of adrenaline, epinephrine, into fat and the increase in fat oxidation and mobilization. But shiver is not just induced by cold, and there are other subtle forms of movement that can greatly increase fat metabolism and fat loss. Many people who had low levels of body fat had a lot of resting tremor, not of the Parkinsonian type, but they would bounce their knee while they were sitting. When they would talk, they would engage in very angular movements. They were sort of electric. People that nod a lot, people that stand up and sit down a lot throughout the day, and people that pace burn anywhere from 800 to 2,500 calories more than the control group in the experiments that they looked at. That simply moving around a lot, even if those are subtle movements, greatly increases the amount of energy that you burn. And people who overeat, the people who can have the second or the third donut or donuts at all and don't seem to put on weight to the same degree, they are people that move around a lot even when seated. Mice that ate a highly palatable, high-fat diet, a great-tasting diet, but only during a restricted feeding window of each 24-hour cycle, maintained or lost weight over time. Whereas mice that ingested the same diet, same amount of calories, but had access to those calories around the clock, gained weight, became obese, and quite sick. And as an additional second point, the mice that restricted their feeding window to a particular portion of 8 hours of every 24-hour cycle actually showed some improvement in important health markers. And what was even more incredible is that mice that only ate during a particular feeding window also experienced some reversal of some prior negative health effects. So by eating around the clock, you're making yourself sicker. By eating at restricted periods of time each 24-hour day, you're actually making yourself healthier, and you are activating certain processes that can positively impact both weight, either maintenance or loss of weight, and positively impacting things like liver health. Also, the expression of different things related to brown fat, the fat that increases your metabolism, and blood glucose regulation. Liver health, bile acid metabolism, energy expenditure, inflammation, liver metabolites. Many aspects of our health are impacted by when we eat, not just what we eat. If your main interest is maintaining and or building muscle, then it can be beneficial to ingest protein early in the day. Let's say you wake up at 7 a.m., your main interest is in hypertrophy or maintenance of muscle, then you would want to ingest some protein sometime before 10 a.m., but obviously if you're interested in getting the health effects of intermittent fasting, that you wouldn't ingest any food for at least the first 60 minutes upon waking. Now, it's not as if at 10:01 a.m. a gate slams shut and you can't generate hypertrophy. Of course, that's not the case. Time-restricted feeding of the same amount of calories did lead to significant decreases in free testosterone. And I think a number of people will raise their eyebrows to that and think, oh, well, then maybe time-restricted feeding is not for me. There are a number of important considerations, of course. One is, while the decrease in free testosterone was significant, it's also going to depend on where people start out. So if somebody has already low or modest levels of testosterone and it drops by 10 or 20%, that could lead them into a state of poor performance and well-being. Whereas if somebody has higher testosterone, a decrease won't necessarily do that. A very interesting change in hormonal profile was cortisol, so-called stress hormone. Cortisol, of course, is also naturally released early in the day in a healthy way to wake you up and promote alertness, but you don't want its levels to be too high or to have peaks in cortisol late in the day. It's actually correlated with depression and a number of other untoward things. I would have thought that by restricting a feeding window to a particular time each day, that these hard training cyclists would have undergone increases in serum cortisol. And in fact, the opposite was true. They had significant reductions in serum cortisol as a consequence of time-restricted feeding. Because cortisol is lower, it may mean that the effects of testosterone or the reduction in testosterone is offset. And that's because cortisol and testosterone are always in this somewhat of a dance in terms of cortisol inhibiting the effects of testosterone largely and vice versa. For sake of hormone health, time-restricted feeding is compatible with quality hormone health, even in high-performing athletes. Based on everything we know and that we've discussed, I would not suggest that people restrict their feeding window to less than 8 hours, especially if they're training hard on a regular basis. And it's not just athletes that should pay attention to this. When we are working very hard, when we are psychologically stressed, when we are studying for exams or we are in conflict with somebody on a regular basis, that creates a stress in the body that's very similar similar to that of physical training. The body and brain don't distinguish between physical stress and mental stress. It's all nervous system. Remember that. It's just cortisol and adrenaline. There's no special hormone just for physical stress versus psychological stress. Again, in thinking about what sort of feeding window will be right for you, we arrive back at this 8-hour time bin that seems flexible for most conditions, even high-performing elite athletes, and I would say, just by logical extension, even for people that have a lot of stress in their life. There is evidence that when people ingest artificial sweeteners, that it can create a transient increase in blood glucose, followed by a transient decrease in blood glucose below baseline. This is thought to explain the increase in hunger caused by ingestion of things like aspartame and sucralose and things of that sort. I think it's fair to say that in moderation, the plant-based non-sugar sweeteners like stevia, in particular stevia, seem to have a minimal impact on overall blood glucose when considered over a fairly large time bin. Just thinking can impact the effects of things like exercise on weight loss. Simply being told that movement is good for you can lead to weight loss, etc., led to significantly more body fat loss, waist to hip ratio changes in the direction that most people would want, and all sorts of other positive effects on things like cardiovascular health, simply by the knowledge that movement and exercise can help various health markers. So this is remarkable, and it speaks to the power of the nervous system and the power of belief in governing aspects of our body and our physiology that one would otherwise think were outside our conscious control. The modern understanding is that it's not adrenaline released systemically, kind of bathing all your fat tissue, but rather it's neurons releasing adrenaline, epinephrine locally, that in theory, exercise that stimulates the release of epinephrine, or exercise coupled with things like shiver or low-grade shaking movement, or the NEAT, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, could in theory lead to local enhancement of mobilization of fat tissue. So I think that spot reduction actually will soon be something that's possible using the appropriate technology. Changing up the pattern of exercise, engaging in novel types of movements may actually be one way that one can access these so-called stubborn body fat paths.
So each time an infant is born, it's this new ecosystem. It's like an island rising up out of the ocean that has no species on it, and suddenly there's this like land rush for, this open territory. We know that infants go through this really complex process of microbiota assembly over the first days, weeks, months, years of life. There are some changes in childhood, adolescence, working into adulthood, but that first 0 to 1 year is a super dynamic time with really stereotypical developmental changes in the gut microbiota that appear to have the possibility of going wrong and causing problems for infants in some instances, whether an infant is born by C-section or born vaginally. Infants that are born by C-section actually have a gut microbiota that looks more like human skin than it does like the birth canal, the vagina microbiota, or the mother's stool microbiota. Babies that are born through the birth canal have initial colonization of vaginal microbes and of stool microbes from their mother. And so just these first days, whether you're born by C-section or through natural childbirth, your gut microbiota looks very different. And then compound on top of that, whether you're breastfed or formula fed, whether your family has a pet or doesn't have a pet, whether you're exposed to antibiotics, there are all these factors that really can change that developmental process and really change your microbial identity eventually in life. When we brought back a healthy diet, a lot of the microbes returned. There was this kind of memory where it went back to very similar to its original state. The difference is that when we put the mice on a low fiber, high fat diet and then kept them on that for multiple generations, we saw this progressive deterioration over the course of generations, where by the 4th generation, the gut microbiome was a fraction of what it originally was. Let's say 30% of the species only remained. Something like 70% of the species had gone extinct or appeared to have gone extinct. We then put those mice back onto a high fiber diet and we didn't see recovery. If we take those 4th generation mice with all the diversity and do a fecal transplant into the mice that had lost their microbes but had been returned to a high fiber diet, all of the diversity was reconstituted. How do we establish new stable stable states. How do we get back to a healthy microbiota if we have taken a lot of antibiotics or have a deteriorated microbiota? It's probably a combination of having access to the right microbes and nourishing those microbes with the proper diet. We're in a really interesting situation in the industrialized world because we have so many problems associated with our digestive tract, and that probably has to do with our highly processed diet and perhaps having a microbiota that's fairly perturbed as well. There's so many diseases that we're dealing with, metabolic syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, that just put a massive portion of the population in a very different category than people that are thinking about how do I maintain health, how do I live a long life, from starting off in what we consider a fairly healthy state. And so things like fasting and a lot of other therapies that have been developed in the field, there can be tremendous benefits in terms of their impact in the context of metabolic syndrome and for people that are battling eating a continual bad diet or something like that. There's just a ton of data that if you eat mostly plants, for most people, that's going to be very healthy. Number one, I'm going to say plant-based fiber is probably super important, and that should be, very high on the list. And she goes on to number two, and he said, stop. If people do number one well, you don't need to know any other rules. I mean, it's basically like if you can have a high fiber plant-based diet, for most people, you don't really need to think about other things because you can't eat too much meat. You can't eat too many sweets. You've already eaten a huge amount of plant-based fiber. Your gut is full. You're not going to be hungry. And it kind of takes care of worrying about what should I eat or what shouldn't I eat. Just eat a ton of whole plant, whole grains, legumes, vegetables, fruit that's high fiber based. One of the things that I think is a pitfall in choosing fermented foods is, you can go down the canned food aisle and there's this huge section of pickles and jars that are canned. Those are not fermented foods. Those are cucumbers that they've put in acetic acid and vinegar to reconstitute that fermented flavor, but there's no live microbes involved in that. And even sauerkrauts in the canned food aisle, even if they were naturally fermented, quite often they're not. Quite often they're just brined in vinegar. But even if they are naturally fermented, all of the microbes are killed prior to canning or during the process of canning. If you want to have live fermented foods that contain live microbes, you need to buy those out of the refrigerated section, essentially. Even though our hypothesis was that the high fiber was going to lead to more short-chain fatty acids produced in the gut, more diverse microbiota, less inflammation in the immune system, we didn't see that across the cohort. We actually saw very individualized responses to the dietary fiber. The big signal really was in the fermented food group. We saw all the things that you would hope to see in a Western microbiota and Western human. We saw this increase in microbiota diversity over the course of the 6 weeks while they were consuming the fermented foods. And we can't always say that higher diversity is better when it comes to our microbial communities. We know there are cases, for instance, bacterial vaginosis, where higher diversity is actually indicative of a disease state. But in the context of the gut and for people living in the industrialized world, higher diversity is generally better. We know that there's a spectrum of diversity. People with higher diversity generally are healthier. If you can push your diversity higher, you're in better shape. And so we saw that increase in diversity. In measuring all these immune parameters, there appeared to be 3 different groups of kind of immune responses that we were seeing. One group that got overall less inflammatory, and then 2 other groups that kind of had a mixed result, partly more inflammatory, partly less inflammatory in all these markers that we were looking at. And when we started digging into like what aspect of the biology of those people dictated or predicted which group they fell into, the really interesting part is the people with the highest diversity gut microbiomes to start the study were the ones that were most likely to have the decreases in inflammation. And so data seem to be telling us that if you start off with a diverse microbiota, maybe one that's better equipped to degrade a wide variety of dietary fiber, you're more likely to respond positively to it. If you have a very depleted gut microbiome, you're not as likely to be able to respond to it. And many of us in the industrialized world have a microbiome that's so depleted now that even if we consume a high fiber diet, at least for a short period of time, we don't have the right microbes in our gut to degrade that fiber.
Probiotics are one of the more expensive supplements out there. You can quickly get into the several hundreds of dollars per month if you're getting the quote unquote best quality ones.
Right.
And if they're actually causing brain fog, then I'm not sure I'd want to use them. A few years back, there were some scientific reports, and as a consequence in the media, that excessive intake of pill form probiotics could create mental fog.